श्री परमात्मने नमः। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्। श्रीमद् भगवत गीता साधक संजीवनी second chapter, contents of the Gita summarized, verses 54 to 72. Description of the marks etc. of the stable in mind. Arjuna puts the question about the illumined one whose intellect has crossed the mire of delusion and who has become steadfast and firm in meditation on God. Verse 54. Arjuna uvacha स्थिता प्रज्ञस्य का भाषा समाधिस्थस्य केशवा स्थिताधिः किं प्रभाषेता किम आसीत व्रजेत किम. Arjuna said, O Keshava, what is the mark of the man of steadfast wisdom established in God? How does the man of firm wisdom speak? How does he sit? And how does he walk? Comment. Lord Krishna in 52nd and 53rd verses said, after crossing the mire of delusion, when your intellect has become steadfast and firm in meditation on God, you will attain self-realization or union with God. Hearing this, Arjuna wants to know his mark when he attains self-realization. Namely, he becomes a man of steadfast wisdom. Now Lord Krishna in the next verse answers Arjuna's first question. Verse 55. Shri Bhagavan Uvacha Prajahati Yada Kaman Sarvan Partha Manogatan Atmanevatmana Tushtaha Sthita Pragyastadachyate. The blessed Lord said, O Partha, when a man abandons all the desires visiting the mind and is satisfied in the self by the self, he is said to be stable in wisdom. Comment. According to the gospel of the Gita, a striver can attain perfection, God realization, by any discipline, that of disinterested action or devotion, etc., which he follows according to his interest and taste, and his perfection is described by that means only. Example, a striver following the discipline of devotion worships God constantly, meditating on Him with exclusive devotion. Therefore, in the enlightened state, he becomes free from malice towards all beings. In the discipline of knowledge, the striver perceives himself detached from these gunas, attributes, and is above them. And in the enlightened state, he sits like a witness firmly established in God beyond all the gunas, having risen above them. Similarly, in Karma Yoga, it is the abandoning of all the desires that is important. Hence, the enlightened soul abandons all desires. In this verse, Lord Krishna dwells upon this point. After abandoning all the desires completely, a man is satisfied in himself and with himself. That is, he is spontaneously contented in his own self. Contentment is of two kinds, as a virtue and as the self. It is a virtue when the mind is free from all desires, and it is the self when even a trace of discontentment is not there. The latter contentment is eternal. It knows no change. It is spontaneous. It is not the result of any practice or thought. The intellect of such a contented man always remains steadfast automatically. Actually, the man is always steady in wisdom, but when he accepts his desires because of unsteady mind, he does not realize his stableness in wisdom. But when he abandons his desires, namely accepts the non-existence of desires, he realizes his stability in wisdom. The next two verses deal with the manner in which a realized soul speaks. Verse 56. दुःखेषु अनुद्विग्ना मनः सुखेषु विगता सप्रियः वीतराग भय क्रोधः sthita dhira munir uchyate. He whose mind remains unperturbed in sorrows, who does not crave for pleasures, and who is free from passion, fear and anger is called the sage of stable wisdom. Comment. Arjuna puts a question attaching importance to action, while Lord Krishna answers attaching importance to feelings, because a change in feeling brings about a corresponding change in action. The Lord is discussing here the feeling or the motive which changes the character of the action throughout. Worldly, it may seem quite different. There is no end of sorrows, calumny, dishonor, and unfavorable circumstances in this world. But the man of wisdom remains unperturbed because the aim of his life is to discharge his duty to the best of his ability and capacity for the welfare of others without having any desire for its fruit. So he always remains happy and unperturbed even in the most unfavorable circumstances. He does not crave for any kind of pleasure such as praise, honor, and favorable circumstances, etc. Nor does he have a desire to prolong such a state. He remains unruffled in the midst of favorable or hostile circumstances. Our entanglement with worldly things is known as attachment, raga. If a stronger person tries to deprive us of worldly possessions, it arouses fear in us. Whereas if a weaker person does so, it arouses anger in us. But the person who is keen to do good to others automatically gets rid of attachments. This freedom from attachment leads him to fearlessness and calmness. Thus, he becomes free from attachment, fear, and anger. So long as there are perturbations, cravings, attachment, fear, and anger, even in a small measure, a man is called a striver. But when he is totally free from them, he becomes an enlightened soul. Lust, desire, craving, and greed, etc., are the forms of attachment. In attachment, there is an attraction for the perishable worldly objects. A contemplative person is free from desire and attachment. He contemplates to remain unattached like an enlightened soul. Throughout his practice, he has been very cautious to remain unattached. Such cautiousness automatically persists in the enlightened soul. Verse 57. Yaha sarvatra nabhisnehastat tat prapya shubhashubham nabhinandati nadveshti tasya pragya pratisthita. He who is unattached everywhere, who is neither delighted at receiving good nor dejected at receiving evil, is poised, stable in wisdom. Comment. In the previous verse, Lord Krishna explained that the man of stable wisdom remains unperturbed while discharging his duty. In this verse, he explains that such a man remains stable in favorable and unfavorable circumstances, which he comes across as a result of the deeds he performs. He remains unattached everywhere, namely, he is not attached to his body, senses, mind, intellect, family, and possessions. He never identifies himself with them, but always remains untainted by them. Despite his physical association with sense, objects, circumstances, and individuals, etc., he remains quite unattached with them through the self. He remains untainted and unaffected by good and bad, favorable and unfavorable circumstances. Meeting with good or pleasant, he is not delighted. This delight means mental joy and expression of joy through words. Meeting with evil or unpleasant, he is not dejected. This dejection means mental suffering and despair, and the thought why and how this situation has occurred and how to get rid of this unpleasant situation. He remains untainted in favorable and unfavorable circumstances which we get as a result of destiny. His determinate intellect now becomes stable in God. He understands that he is entirely unconcerned with the good and evil of the world because they always change, while he always remains the same. There is no modification in the self, while in the evolutes of matter, there is always modification. The man identifies himself with the body and regards the modification of the body as modification in his own self. But when he realizes the two as separate entities, his intellect becomes stable. Now Lord Krishna answers the third question. How does an equanimous person sit? Verse 58. Yada saharate chayam kurmangani sarvashaha indriyani indriyarthe bhayas tasya pragya pratisthita. When like a tortoise which draws in its limbs from all directions, he withdraws his senses from sense objects, his wisdom becomes stable. Comment. Here the purpose of illustration of the tortoise is that as a tortoise withdraws its 6 limbs, 4 legs, a tail and a forehead into the shell to protect itself against possible dangers, so does an enlightened one also withdraw his 5 senses and 1 mind from sense objects. If he has the least affinity with senses, he can't be the man of stable wisdom. When the senses are withdrawn from their sense objects, the self-substance, which is axiomatic, is realized because that is beyond the limit of time. Self-realization or God-realization is axiomatic and is beyond the reach of senses, but we are veiled by the curtain of pleasures and thus can't realize him who still exists. But as soon as that veil is raised, namely, we renounce our affinity to the worldly pleasures, he is revealed. Lord Krishna explains in the next verse that mere withdrawal of the senses from sense objects is not the mark of the man of steadfast wisdom. Verse 59. Veshya vinivartante niraharasya dehinaha रसाव्रजम रसोप्यस्य param drishtva nivartate. Sense objects cease for him who does not enjoy them with his senses, but the taste for them persists. This relish also disappears of the man of stable mind when he intuits the Supreme. Comment. A man becomes abstinent in 2 ways. 1. To fast by one's own will or owing to sickness. Second, to abstain from sense enjoyments. The senses of a sick man become unfit for indulgence, but craving in them for sense enjoyment persists. They hope to enjoy them after recovery. Similarly, sense objects cease for the abstinent striver, but his taste persists. It means that his body and senses become under restraint, but his mind wanders. Thus, dispassionate strivers who have instinctively no attachment to pleasure become free from this taste. The striver who wants to follow the spiritual path but is not dispassionate can restrain his body and senses by thinking of the adverse consequences of sense enjoyments. The relish of the man of steadfast wisdom who intuits the Supreme disappears. It is a rule, but it's contrary that with the disappearance of relish, a striver attains steadfast wisdom is not true. A striver has taste in his egoism, namely I-ness. This taste changes itself into attachment. Therefore, a striver should have determination that he as a striver has no attachment, no desire. This sort of determination frees him from relish, and after realizing God, this relish disappears altogether. What is the harm if this relish does not cease? Is explained in the next verse. Verse 60. Yatato heapi kantya purushasya vipaschitaha indriyani brahmathini haranti prasabham manha. The turbulent senses, O son of Kunti, forcibly carry away the mind of even a wise man who is practicing self-control. Comment. The term wise man has been used for the man who practices self-control, who performs his duty without attachment and desire for its fruit, who discriminates between the real and the unreal, and who thinks for the welfare of all creatures. The turbulent senses of even such a wise man carry away his mind towards pleasures. The reason is that so long as mind is not permanently established in God, the past influences of the enjoyment of pleasures attract senses and mind towards pleasures forcibly. Even some sages could not control this temptation. Therefore, a striver should never believe his senses and should be always on his guard. Moreover, he should never feel proud of sense control. In the next verse, Lord Krishna explains how to control the turbulent senses which forcibly carry away the mind of even a wise man in whom the taste for sense objects still persists. Verse 61. Tani sarvani sayamya yukta sita mat paraha vashe hi yasya indriyani tasya pragya pratisthita. Having controlled all the senses, a striver should sit for meditation, devoting himself heart and soul to me. For his wisdom, mind is stable, constant, whose senses are under control. Comment. By controlling the senses, the striver should devote himself heart and soul to me. Moreover, he should not feel proud of his sense control because pride goes before a fall. He should rather feel that it was only God's grace which enabled him to control his senses. Generally, in a striver following the discipline of action, there is predominance of action. Therefore, he develops egoism. Due to this egoistic feeling, he pays little attention to the divine grace. Though the endowment of human body, inclination, practice, and success of this discipline are all the result of the divine grace. By his special divine grace, the Lord is exhorting the striver to be devoted to him. Thus, he should devote himself heart and soul to him, thinking that he is God's and God is his, while he is neither of the world nor the world is his. He should infuse the sense of I in only God, not in the world at all. When a striver devotes himself heart and soul to God, his senses are controlled and his relish taste for sense enjoyments disappears. But what about those who don't devote themselves to God? The answer is provided in the next two verses. Verses 62 and 63. ध्यायतो विषयान् पुंसः संगास्तेषुपजायते संगात् संजायते कामः कामात् क्रोधोऽभिजायते क्रोधाद् भवति समूहः समूहात् स्मृतिविभ्रमः स्मृतिभ्रंशात् बुद्धिनाशो बुद्धिनाशात् प्रणश्यति. Brooding on the objects of senses, a man develops attachment for them. From attachment springs up desire. From desire ensues anger. From anger arises delusion. From delusion, confusion of memory. From confusion of memory, loss of reason. And from loss of reason, discrimination. He goes to complete ruin. Comment. When a man does not devote himself to God, he does not meditate on God. He broods on objects of senses because in that case there is nothing else to brood on except the world. Thus, by brooding over them, he develops attachment for them. Due to this attachment, he enjoys sense objects. This enjoyment may be mental or physical. The pleasure resulting from enjoyment enhances attachment. Due to this enhanced attachment, he repeatedly dwells on sense objects. It is a rule that the enhanced attachment persists whether he enjoys the sense objects or not. By developing attachment for sense enjoyments, one has a desire to acquire and enjoy those sense objects. Gratification of desire misleads to greed, and one who creates an obstacle in the possibility of its gratification becomes a victim of anger. The desire for respect and honor on the ground of caste, stage of life, and virtues, etc., also causes anger if some obstacles are put in its gratification. Desire is a Rajasika trait, delusion at Tamasika 1, and anger lies between the two. If you are angry with anyone, it means that you have attachment for something or the other. If you are angry with the man who defames you, it means that you are attached to fame. If you are enraged with a person who censures you, it proves your pride of your flawlessness, and so on. From anger ensues delusion. In fact, delusion ensues not only from anger but also from desire, greed, and attachment. Delusion born of desire veils discrimination, and so a man goaded by desire performs undesirable actions. Out of anger, a deluded man utters harsh and pinching words to even friends and adorable ones, and performs wrong and cruel deeds. Delusion born of greed makes a man blind, and he can't distinguish between the real and the unreal, the right and the wrong, and he cheats others by using fraudulent methods. Delusion born of attachment creates partiality. Now the question arises, why Lord Krishna has said that delusion ensues from anger while it ensues from desire, greed, and attachment as well. If we give a serious thought, we come to know that goaded by desire, greed, and attachment, a man thinks of his own selfish motive and pleasures, while in anger he thinks of doing evil to others. Thus, delusion born of anger is more disastrous than that born of the other three. Therefore, Lord Krishna has said that delusion ensues from anger. From delusion arises confusion of memory. It means that a man forgets the decision which he took to attain salvation or to follow the spiritual path in accordance with the ordinance of the scriptures, etc. From confusion of memory ensues loss of reason, namely, a man cannot discriminate between right and wrong. Loss of discrimination paves the way to self destruction. Therefore, it is obligatory for all the strivers to devote themselves heart and soul to God in order to escape this self destruction. Brooding on the objects of senses leads to attachment. Attachment leads to desire, desire to anger, anger to delusion, delusion to loss of memory to loss of reason, and finally, loss of reason leads to utter ruin. Though it takes time to describe this order, yet the rise of these propensities leading to the destruction of man is as fast as death caused by an electric shock. Verses 64 and 65. Ragadvesha vimuktastu Vishyan indriyashcharan Atma vashyar vidhyatma Prasadam adhigachati Prasade sarva dukkhanam Hanirasyopjayate Parasanna chetaso hayashu Buddhiha paryavatishte. But the self-controlled yogi, while enjoying the sense objects with the senses, which are controlled and free from attraction and aversion, attains placidity of mind. With the attainment of such placidity of mind, all his sorrows come to an end, and the intellect of such a person of tranquil mind soon becomes firmly established in God. Comment. To achieve his aim, it is very necessary for a striver, especially for a karma yogi, to control his mind. Otherwise, he may have attachment for pleasure and thus may go to ruin. Attachment and aversion are rooted in all sense objects. A striver should not come under their sway because they are verily his enemies. The striver who is free from the pairs of opposites such as attachment and aversion, etc., is easily set free from bondage. The striver who enjoys the sense objects being free from attachment and aversion attains placidity, purity of mind. This placidity serenity of mind is called mental austerity, which is superior to the austerity of body and austerity of speech. So, a striver should neither enjoy the sense objects with attachment nor should renounce them with aversion, because both attachment and aversion lead him to the affinity for the world. Such a striver attains placidity of mind, and if that placidity of mind is not enjoyed, that leads to God realization. With the attainment of such placidity of mind, all his sorrows come to an end, because it is attachment only which causes sorrows. These sorrows give birth to desire, which again causes sorrows. When attachment goes away, the mind becomes serene, and that serenity destroys all sorrows. Actually, all the sorrows are born because of affinity for matter and its evolutes, the world and the body. A striver has affinity to the world with the desire to enjoy pleasures. This desire is born of despair or the feeling of something lacking in himself. When there is placidity of mind, despair disappears. When despair disappears, there is no desire for pleasures, and when there is no desire for pleasures, affinity for the world automatically breaks off, and then sorrows disappear. It means that placidity of the mind results in breaking off affinity for the world and establishment of the self in God. Something remarkable. Enhancement of either placidity or uneasiness for God enables a striver to realize God. The gopis were locked up by their husbands, brothers, and parents and prevented from going to meet Lord Krishna. The uneasiness to meet the Lord destroyed their sins, and the placidity of the mind by the meditation on God destroyed their virtues. Thus, being free from sins and virtues and leaving their bodies, they were the first to meet God. But in the worldly affairs, placidity and uneasiness of mind mislead a man to bondage and strengthen the bondage, because his aim is to enjoy the worldly pleasures. The living examples are the common worldly people who are entangled in the worldly snare because of placidity and uneasiness in mundane affairs. The inner self is overwhelmed in placidity and uneasiness, just as the color which is added to liquid wax becomes a permanent part of it. In the same way, whatever thoughts are put into the overwhelmed inner self, they become a permanent part of it and lead the striver to salvation or mislead him to damnation. Therefore, a striver should neither be pleased nor displeased while gaining or losing the most charming objects of the world. Lord Krishna clarifies the point of view expressed in the previous two verses by negative inference. Verse 66. Nasti buddhir ayuktasya nacha yuktasya bhavna nacha bhavyataha shantir ashantasya kutaha sukham. He who has not controlled his mind and senses can have no determinate intellect, nor can such an undisciplined man have the sense of duty. The man without having the sense of duty can have no peace, and how can there be happiness for one lacking peace? Comment. In the discipline of disinterested action, control over the mind and senses is important, because without control, desire persists, and with the persistence of desire, the mind does not get fixed. Therefore, it is obligatory for a striver following the discipline of action to control his mind and senses. But what happens to the man who has not controlled his mind and senses is explained in this verse. He who has not controlled his mind and senses cannot have the determinate intellect that he has only to realize God, because he indulges in worldly pleasures and prosperity. He develops desire for riches, honor, and bodily comforts, etc. These numerous desires keep his intellect obsessed and don't allow him to have his intellect stable. He whose intellect is not determinate can't have the feeling that he has to discharge his duty by renouncing attachment and desire, etc., because he has not fixed the aim of his life. The man who does not discharge his duty efficiently and sincerely can have no peace whosoever he may be. How can he who lacks peace be happy? He can't be happy because his heart is filled with agitation and commotion. Despite acquiring all agreeable sense objects, his mental perturbation can't be wiped out. In other words, he can't be happy. In the next verse, Lord Krishna explains why intellect of the person who had not controlled his mind and senses cannot be determinate. Verse 67. Indriyanam hi chartam yan manonuvidhyate tad asya harti pragyam vajurnavam ivambhasi. Just as the wind carries away a ship on the water, the mind that yields to any one of the wandering senses takes away the discrimination of man. Comment. God has bestowed upon man this human body to attain him. So a man should firmly resolve to attain God realization. This resolve removes his attachment for pleasures and makes his intellect determinate. But what happens if the intellect does not become determinate has been described here. Senses are involuntarily drawn to the sense objects. The mind that follows any one of the senses is naturally led astray by it. For example, while relishing a tasteful dish, the sense of taste gets attached to it and then it attracts the mind, and thus the misdirected mind gets entangled in this taste. When the mind gets entangled in pleasures, the man immediately loses his determinate intellect that he has to realize God only. A ship without a rudder is at the mercy of a strong wind. As a rudderless ship does not reach its destination, the misdirected mind carries away man's discrimination. The strong wind either pushes away the ship in the wrong direction or sinks it, but a skillful sailor manages the ship in such a way that the wind, instead of pushing it away from its course, helps it in sailing and reaching its destination. Similarly, the misdirected mind misguides the discrimination in two ways. It leads it astray from the path of God realization and engages him in sense pleasures, or it ruins it by entangling it in prohibited pleasures. But the controlled mind and senses don't take the intellect wayward, they rather help him in realizing God. Now, in the next verse, Lord Krishna describes the condition of the striver who has controlled his senses. Verse 68. Tasmad yasya mahabaho nigrihitani sarvashaha indriyani indriyarthebhyastasya pragya pratishtita. Therefore, O mighty armed, his intellect is stable, whose senses are completely restrained from their objects. Comment. Senses are not inclined towards pleasures, whether he lives in the world or in seclusion, and even if his mind and senses are directed to the sense objects, they don't lead his intellect astray. The senses have no attachment to the sense objects. As a snake without teeth has no poison, the senses without attachment and aversion have no poison to degrade a man from spiritual path. They become sublimated and lead a striver to divinity. This verse means that if a striver has determination that his aim is to realize God rather than to enjoy worldly pleasures and prosperity, his intellect will become stable. What is the difference between a striver whose senses are completely restrained from their objects and an ordinary man? Here is the answer. Verse 69. Ya nisha sarva bhutanam tasyam jagrati sayami yasyam jagrati bhutani sa nisha pashyata munihe. That which is night to all beings In that state, the self-controlled person keeps awake, and that in which all beings keep awake is night to the enlightened seer. Comment. Those worldly people whose senses and mind are uncontrolled and who are immersed in pleasures are asleep in the dark because they never think that the aim of human life is emancipation or salvation. Further, they never think what is God, what is self-realization, why are we suffering, why are there all these burning sensations, where will our misdeeds take us. Turning face from these thoughts is complete darkness for the worldly people. The human beings who hanker after pleasures and prosperity and are immersed in them are like other beings such as birds and beasts, etc., because both have no inclination for God realization. If there is any difference between the two, that is that human beings' discrimination is much more developed than beasts and birds, and therefore by using this discrimination, they can serve others and attain salvation or God realization, while birds and beasts can't. On the other hand, if they misuse this discrimination in hankering after pleasures and prosperity, they can be more harmful to the society than ever the wild beasts. Animals and birds eat food only to sustain their life. They never hoard. But human beings are given to hoarding whatever they get. Therefore, they create obstacles to the utilization of those things by others. When the worldly people remain asleep in the dark, having no inclination for God realization, the seer who has controlled his senses and mind and who has no attachment for pleasures and prosperity and whose aim of life is only God realization, remains wakeful because his intuition, his concepts and precepts are all filled with divinity. The worldly people who want to accumulate wealth by means fair or foul and who hanker after transient sensual pleasures, honor and praise, etc., are wakeful to the mundane affairs. The worldly people feel very happy and deem themselves very wise in enjoying and hoarding worldly pleasures. To those, the seer in the state of divine knowledge and supreme bliss perceives as dark. As children, while playing marbles, attach great importance to the small balls of marble, glass, or clay. The people attach importance to the worldly prosperity and pleasures, and for gaining them, they employ all sorts of means, fair or foul. But the self controlled seer knows that all the mundane pleasures, prosperity, and praise, etc., are transient, illusory, and kaleidoscopic, while God and his own self are eternal, real, and permanent. He also knows how the best use of mundane objects can be made and how far they can be utilized for the welfare of others. He uses them in the service of others. In spite of the manifest appearance of the world to the mind and senses, he has a firm conviction that the world is a mere illusion. It has no real existence at all. So, wakefulness of the worldly people is just like a dark night for him. The world is just like a dark night to the seer. Then, how does he live in the world? The answer to these queries is provided in the verse that follows. Verse 70. Apurya manam achla pratishtham samundram apaha pravishanti yadvat tadvat kamayam pravishanti sarve sa shantim apnoti na kama kami. As waters of different rivers enter the ocean, which though full remains undisturbed, likewise the man in whom all enjoyments merge themselves attains peace, not he who hankers after such enjoyments. Comment. In rainy season, the rivers expand and are flooded by heavy rainstorms. All those rivers continue to pour themselves into the ocean, but its magnitude ever remains the same. In summer, When heat evaporates the water of rivers and the rivers become narrow, having shallow water, even then the expanse of the ocean remains the same. It is ever full and never desires water from streams and rivers. It means that it ever remains satiated. It always remains within limits. The self-controlled seer is like the ocean. He also comes across the worldly enjoyments, but they all merge in him without causing any perturbation or agitation in his mind and body. Thus he attains supreme peace. This peace is not due to mundane objects, but it has emanated from God realization. The worldly enjoyments and pleasures can't satisfy a man who hankers after them. He can never be satisfied. He can never be free from desires, anxieties, and burning sensation. So, how can he attain peace? The reason is that the insentient can't satisfy the sentient. The sentient can be satisfied only by the sentient. Now, Lord Krishna concludes the answer to the last question. How does the man of steadfast wisdom walk? Namely, what is the mode of conduct? Verse 71. Vihaya kamaniyaha sarvan pumanscharti niha saprihaha nirmamo nirankarha sa shantim adhigachti. He who gives up all desires and moves free from the sense of mind, egoism, and thirst for necessities of life attains peace. Comment. An earnest wish for something is kamna, desire, while an earnest wish for acquiring or preserving necessities of life is sapriha, thirst. The man of steadfast wisdom lives devoid of longings and desires and has no thirst for acquiring or preserving even the necessities of life because he has attained the supreme bliss for which the human body was bestowed upon him. So he becomes free from all cares and does not care even for his body whether it lives or dies. The man of stable wisdom has not the least sense of mind with men, things, and even his body and senses because he has received them from the world and therefore they belong to the world, not to him. It is a blunder to have the sense of possession over the things acquired. On rectifications of this blunder, the sense of possession over persons, objects, body, and sense organs is totally wiped out. I am this body. To have this notion is egoism. The realized soul is free from the egoism. The body, sense organs, mind, and intellect are visible in some light. This ego is also perceived in this light. From the viewpoint of this light, all these are objects of perception. The onlooker, seer, is quite different from the seen. This is the rule. With this realization, the man of steady wisdom becomes quite free from egoism. In the verse, out of the four, desires, thirst for necessities, the sense of mind, and egoism. Egoism is more important than the other three because a striver, after becoming free from egoism, becomes free from the other three also. If there is no egoism, how will the sense of mind persist? Who will desire and for whom will he desire? Now the question arises, when the renunciation of desire etc. is also included in the renunciation of egoism, why has Lord Krishna described renunciation of desire? The answer is that out of these four, desire is dull, while thirst for necessities is subtle, the sense of mind subtler, and egoism the subtlest. So, by abandoning desire, it becomes easy to abandon the other three. Anything can't be gained merely by desire. What is destined, we will get. Having such faith, we should discard desires. Sapriha is a subtle form of desire. In absence of desire, it persists. Sapriha is the desire to have bare necessities of life. In its fulfillment, also, we are not free. Whatever is to happen will happen. Then why should we have sapriha? When we cease dependence on food, water, and clothing, sapriha is destroyed. After renouncing desires and sapriha, the sense of mind in the body remains. This is not a rule that this possessive spirit preserves articles and they are ruined without this spirit. Therefore, the possessive spirit serves no purpose. With renunciation of all the three desires, priya, subtle desire, and possessive spirit, the renunciation of ego becomes very easy. Otherwise, it is very difficult. How to get rid of egoism and the sense of mind? From the standpoint of discipline of devotion, what is called I or mine actually belongs to God, because had the person's things body been mine, I might have protected them from decay and possessed them forever. But it is not so. It means that the so-called my body, senses, mind, intellect, etc. are his, and I am also his. By having this sort of feeling, a striver becomes free from the sense of mine and egoism. In the next verse, there is a description of the man having spiritual illuminations as a result of being free from desire, thirst for necessities of life, the sense of mine and egoism. Verse 72. Esha Brahmi Sthitiha Partha Nenam Prapya Vimuhayati Stitva Syam Antakalayapi Brahma Nirvanam Richati. O Partha, such is the state of the God-realized soul. Having attained this state, he overcomes delusion. Being established in this state, even at the death hour, he attains Brahmic bliss, identification with the absolute state. Comment. On being free from egoism, individuality is completely wiped out, and then a striver is automatically established in God. Individuality persisted only due to affinity with the world. With renunciation of affinity, individuality is completely gone. This is the state of Godhood, union with God. So long as a man has egoism, the feeling of I, in the body, he is deluded. Lack of discrimination between the real and the unreal is delusion. The man himself, being real, identifies himself with the unreal. This identification is delusion. When a striver knows the unreal as unreal, his affinity to it ceases, and he realizes that he is already established in the real. With this realization, he is never deluded. This human body has been bestowed upon man only for God realization. So the Lord gives an opportunity even to the vilest sinner to attain him by establishing himself in him, even at the time of death, namely by breaking off his affinity with matter. By being established in this state, even at the time of death, one attains Brahma. Now a question arises, how a man who could not attain God throughout his life can attain him at the time of death when his body and intellect both grow weak? The answer is that man's union with him is spontaneous. Only he has to realize this fact, and this fact can be realized either by God's or saints' grace or by good influences of the past actions. Something noteworthy. Man himself is sentient, but he has accepted his affinity for the insentient. Therefore, instead of attaining salvation or God realization, he goes to ruin. By using his discrimination, he thinks to attain God, while out of delusion, he wants to have affinity to the matter. Delusion is born of egoism, the sense of mine or desire. To accept the body as I or mine is delusion born of egoism, the sense of mine, while the wish to acquire or preserve something is the delusion born of desire. To remove this delusion, Lord Krishna has talked about two kinds of discrimination. Discrimination between the real and the unreal, and discrimination between discharging one's duty and abandoning it. While discriminating between the body and the soul, Lord Krishna explained that there was never a time when he or those kings were non-existent, nor they would cease to exist in future. It is a fact that these bodies didn't exist before, nor will they exist in future, and in the interim also. They are changing every moment as every born one passes through babyhood, youth, and old age. He also explained that as a man discarding worn out clothes takes new ones, likewise the embodied soul, casting off worn out bodies, enters into others which are new. So he should not grieve. While explaining the discrimination between discharging one's duty and abandoning it, he said, there is nothing more welcome for a man of the warrior class than a righteous war, which is an open gateway to heaven. If you don't wage it, you will incur sin. But if you fight, treating pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat alike, you will not incur sin. Your right is to perform your duty, but never to its fruit. Let not the fruit of action be your object, nor let your attachment be to inaction. Therefore, perform your duty being fixed in yoga, because equanimity consists in remaining even minded in success and failure. The man who endowed with equanimity performs his duty, becomes free from virtues and vices in his lifetime. When your intellect transcends the mire of delusion, and when it, confused by having conflicting statements, becomes poised and firmly fixed in meditation on God, you will attain union with God. Om Tat Sat. All glories to Partha Sarthi Lord Shri Krishna. All glories to Bhagavad Vani Srimad Bhagavad-Gita. Shri Hari Arpanamastu.